Hebrews chapter 13, verses 10 through 14 today. And the sermon is going to be called, We Worship Outside the Camp. And this is actually a pretty fascinating little piece of text. We worship outside the camp. Let me start off by reading it, and then we'll go through and exposit the text. We have an altar from which those who serve the tent have no right to eat. For the bodies of those animals whose blood is brought into the holy places by the high priest as a sacrifice for sin are burned outside of the camp. And so Jesus also suffered outside of the gate in order to sanctify the people through his own blood. Therefore, let us go to him outside of the camp and bear the reproach that he endured. For here we have no lasting city, but we seek the city that is to come. Like I said, it's a powerful little section of text, guys. And if I was just to give you a clean, simple little overview of what he's going to say in this text, he's been arguing with these Jewish Christians, shouldn't be anything new to us today, that have been tempted to go back to the old system because that old system had a familiar, unique identity to it. When we say the old system, we mean the Torah, we mean the temple, we mean Jerusalem, the priesthood, the Day of Atonement, the sacrifices. We covered a couple sermons ago that he touched on food regulations. They wanted to go back to those food regulations because all of those things, holy places, holy buildings, different rules and regulations, gave them a feeling and a sense of identity, what they had always been used to. But what he's been arguing is because of Christ and his sacrifice, we have a brand new identity, and the whole purpose of the book of Hebrews has been to say, embrace this new identity. And if you need strengthening, if you need an identity, if you need something to hold on to give you power and grace in this life. Last sermon, he said, hold on to grace. What is grace? Grace is that God loved you and reached out to you, and while you were still sinners living in darkness, gave his Son to die for your sins, reconciled you back to himself, and now you have his invitation to enter boldly into his presence. And then we wait and we look forward to a heavenly city. He's getting his audience to embrace this new identity and let go of some of the old traditions that they were used to. In this text, this is going to be his final climactic appeal. Something else that they need to do differently to encourage them to walk in a newness of life and not in the same way that they've walked previously. So the little overview here is that in Christ you have a new identity. And the key to this text, guys, he is appealing to Leviticus chapter 16. What he's going to do is he's going to give them a little snippet of Leviticus chapter 16, and a little bit Leviticus chapter 16 explains the atonement for sins, the animal sacrifice that needs to happen in order to atone for the sins of Israel. And then he's going to use Leviticus 16 to exhort and exposit to his audience that was just a type and a shadow of what God was going to do in the future. That was a type and a shadow of Jesus' sacrificial death. And you're being tempted to go back to that old system of worship, and specifically what he's going to anchor them in today is he's going to anchor them into the new mode of worship. It's not through the temple anymore. It's not through that priesthood anymore. It's something new and different, and that's going to be what he's urging them to embrace. He's going to do that by saying, we go outside of the camp to worship God. Leave behind that sacred city. Leave behind that sacred building, because we seek a city that has yet to come. And then I'll recall this. He doesn't use this, but he's already given us in chapter 11, Hebrews chapter 11. He's already talked about how Abraham left to go to a city. He was seeking a city that God was building. And then he goes on to say that all of those people of that time all lived this life of faith, this life of transcendent reality rather than an earthly reality. All the Old Testament figures lived this transcendent reality because they had their eyes fixed. They were seeking, and he says in chapter 11, a city not made with hands, but a city that is eternal, that God has made in the heavenly places. So even in the Old Testament, this idea of a transcendent metaphysical city in heavenly places is where they were headed. And that's what he's going to tell his audience. Don't take your eyes off of the metaphysical, transcendent, heavenly city because you want to go back to Jerusalem, because you want to go back to that temple, because you want to go back to something physical. The sacrifice of Christ gives us a brand new altar that supersedes that old Levitical temple system. And he's going to tell them these are mutually exclusive. You can't worship at Christ's new altar and go back and worship at that old physical altar. You've got to choose one or the other because they're mutually exclusive of each other. Boy, what a powerful message of enlightenment it would be if we could present this text to some of the Jewish friends that we have today that are still waiting for the reestablishment of that old temple system and that old sacrificial system. And the whole point that the preacher is making here is he says, no. The new covenant means we go outside the gate to worship, because outside the gate is where the new altar is at. Don't go back to that old one. He says this because Christ is superior in every way. The new covenant is superior to the old one, and we've covered that in quite detail in many of our sermons. The all-sufficiency of Christ's sacrifice doesn't need anything added to it. We don't need to add circumcision to it. In other places, he's going to say we don't need to add any food regulations to the work, the finished work of Christ. And today he's going to argue we don't need to add any holy, sacred, geographic locations, holy, sacred cities, and we don't need to add any kind of holy or sacred buildings. He says, leave all of that behind. Let's go outside of the city, because outside of the city is where Christ was crucified, and that's where our new altar is. He is drawing a definite line in the sand that we no longer do things that way. We've got a brand new way of doing things. It's an ultimatum for his readers also, because he has told them, if you go back to that old altar, then you have no right to partake of the new altar. It has been superseded, and you have to choose one or the other. Now, he's already given ultimatums to the audience, hasn't he, his readers? He's already said, if you've tasted the heavenly gifts in Hebrews 6, You've tasted the new covenant, the heavenly gifts. You've tasted grace and forgiveness. If you choose to leave that and go back to the old system, then there remains no opportunity for repentance for you. There is no sacrifice that will cover that deliberate sin. He's already given them ultimatums. So let's begin expositing our text. Verse 10. We have an altar from which those who serve the tent have no right to eat. This is going to be his final climactic juxtaposition between the old way and the new way. Let me give you 2 or 3 of these juxtapositions that he's already created for his audience, and then we'll come back to this one here. Before this, in Hebrews chapter 8, he's already told them we have a new covenant, so that means the old one needs to go away. Hebrews 8:13. In speaking of a new covenant, he makes the first one obsolete. And what is becoming obsolete and growing old is ready to vanish away. The old Mosaic system, the old Jewish system, the Torah, Jerusalem, the temple and the priesthood, all of that is growing old and ready to vanish away because we have a brand new covenant in Jesus Christ that has replaced it. He goes on to say that all those laws and shadows in the Torah were just types and shadows of the realities that were going to come later on. Let me give you that one. That's Hebrews chapter 10 and verse 1. The law was just a shadow of the good things to come instead of the true form of the realities. Distinctiveness. Finally, he talks about 2 different mountains. Mount Sinai, which represents an earthly covenant, the Torah, Moses, he said that mountain was terrifying and gloomy and firing. We didn't like that mountain. We've now come to a brand new mountain, Mount Zion, in heavenly places. So don't go back to that old mountain. That's in Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 18. You have not come to what may be touched, a blazing fire and darkness and gloom. Verse 22. But you have come to Mount Zion and to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem. Can you see how he's replacing all of the physical, earthly, geographic locations and saying now what we aspire for is what has replaced and superseded all those types and shadows. Now we aspire for the realities which are transcendent, heavenly, divine, metaphysical realities. And so that's what we need to set our sights on. So today we come to his 4th climactic comparison. We have an altar from which those who serve in the tent have no right to eat. Those who persist in worshiping at that old altar in Jerusalem and at the temple, and he says they have no right to this new altar that we worship at. Now that language to his Jewish audience would have been very inflammatory because in that time, in that day, the altar was how men were made right with God. Under that Mosaic system, you had to have an altar where animals were sacrificed in order to atone for men's broken relationship with God. But we've already covered that animal sacrifices could never really take away sins, because if they could take away sins, you wouldn't have to repeatedly, all the time, over and over and over, continue offering animal sacrifices. So he said Christ did away with that system by his once and for all sacrifice, and then he went and he was seated in the heavenly places. He contrasts Jesus sitting in heavenly places in his high priest office Can you guys remember that the priests in the Old Testament never got to sit down? They were always refreshing the bread of presence, lighting the candles, replenishing the oil. They were always running around doing stuff, burning incense. They could never sit down. Why? Because nothing that they could do could atone for sins. But when Jesus gave His once and for all sacrifice, He went into the true Holy of Holies as God's true high priest, and He sat down because there's nothing else that needs to be done. So when you talk about altars, that would have been a very vivid aspect of Jewish life. And He is telling them that now there is a new altar, the sacrifice of Christ, that has superseded the sacrificial altar that they are very used to. Because Christ is superior in every way. And His once and for all sacrifice is sufficient in every way. Nothing else needs to be added to it. So He's trying to ground His readers in this new reality. If we move on in our text, He's going to get into expositing Leviticus chapter 16, verses 11 and 12 here. For the body of those animals whose blood was brought into the holy place by the high priest as a sacrifice for sin, and then it's burned outside of the camp. So Jesus also suffered outside of the gate in order to sanctify people through His own blood. Do you see that He has just taken Leviticus 16, exposited part of the text, and painted the picture of the heavenly reality that the Day of Atonement and sacrifice was just a type and a shadow. The type was you sacrifice an animal, the blood goes into the Holy of Holies in the temple, but the carcass of the animal needs to get burned outside of the camp. And he says that was just a type and a shadow of Christ's sacrifice. Christ's blood as a high priest, He went directly into the true Holy of Holies Himself, and His body was sacrificed outside of the camp. I didn't give you this text. Oh, it comes a little bit later. Let me save that. So He's just revealed, He's just exposited the type and the shadow, and now we have the reality in Christ. Let me show you that text in Leviticus 16 that He's talking about, and how this procedure for atoning for sins, this is called the Day of Atonement. Here was the old type and shadow procedures for doing that. Leviticus chapter 16 and verse 27. And the bull for the sin offering and the goat for the sin offering, whose blood was brought to make atonement into the holy place, the carcass should be carried outside of the camp. Their skin and their flesh and their dung shall be burned with fire. That's the text that the preacher just quoted to them, the tradition and the identity that they were used to. And he tries to help them see, he tries to encourage them. Don't you see that was just a type and a shadow? Jesus went Himself into the Holy of Holies, and His body was sacrificed on an altar, metaphorically, outside of the camp. Hebrews chapter 13, he says specifically, Jesus suffered outside of the gate, letting us know that that was a common first century understanding. The closest thing we have to that is John 19 and verse 20, where it says, many of the Jews read the inscription that was placed above Jesus because they used to walk by where He was crucified. And it said they used to walk by there because He was crucified near the city, not in the city. near the city, outside of the gates. And historically, we know that that was Roman tradition. Roman tradition was that a Roman citizen couldn't be crucified. And so if you were crucified, they took you outside of the Roman city and put you out there with the dogs. Tradition, Roman history records that for us. So that is what he's appealing to. And now he's going to infer something from that text. If we go on in our text here, verses 13 and 14, therefore, let us go to him outside of the camp and bear the reproach that he endured, because here we have no lasting city, but we seek the city that is to come. Jerusalem and the temple existed at this time, 64 AD. And in multiple ways, Jesus and other New Testament writers said, destruction is coming. Not one stone will be left on top of another one. Part of getting rid of the old system will be to have the Gentiles come in and get rid of the sacred places and the sacred buildings. And that happened in 70 AD when Rome came, destroyed Jerusalem, destroyed the temple. That's exactly what was supposed to happen. And the book of Daniel says the Messiah must show up before the temple is destroyed. It would be so great if we could impress upon our community that the temple has already been destroyed, so the Messiah must have already come. You can't still be waiting for a Messiah. The time is past. It's too late now. So this is the second example of, he says, because Jesus was sacrificed outside of the city, outside of the camp, the same way the Levitical sacrifices were sacrificed outside the camp, he now draws his conclusion and gives an exhortation. Therefore, you guys need to be willing to leave the city and go worship Jesus outside where he was crucified. Now, I just caught myself. I don't think that he's using a metaphor here, because it looks like his audience is actually in Rome. It looks like the preacher here is writing to an audience that is in Italy. But he's letting them know that Jerusalem and the temple is no longer the place to aspire to. So when he says, let's worship outside of the camp, he's not telling Christians to go to Golgotha where Jesus was crucified. He's metaphorically saying, leave behind the pilgrimage that you're wanting to make back to a holy city and a holy building. Let go of that and leave that behind, and set your sights on the pilgrimage that you're really destined for, that heavenly Jerusalem, the heavenly Zion. That heavenly city, set your sights on that place. Be willing to get outside of the city and endure the reproach and the embarrassment, just like Jesus did, by leaving behind the traditions that you're wanting to go back to. Let me put a pin in the sermon right there, because he's talking about the Levitical method of atonement where the carcass gets taken outside the camp. I want to show you something else that I think is a type and a shadow. He didn't give it to you here. I couldn't help but add it. If you look at Exodus chapter 25 through Exodus 33, something happened in that text. In Exodus 25, God, through Moses, tells the people, you will be my people, I will be your God, and I will dwell in your midst. So this first idea, this first eschatologic goal that God has, is to be able to place himself in the midst of his rescued people that he rescued out of Egypt. That's in 25. By the time we get to Exodus chapter 32, while Moses is up on the mountain, Israel has already broken their covenant with God because they've put all of their gold together. They've melted all of their gold and they have made for themselves a golden calf. And they've all worshiped that. This is the God that saved you out of Egypt. They've already broken the covenant relationship with God. And as a result of that, God says, I am not going to dwell in your midst because I would destroy you. If you did this kind of sin and rebellion while I was in your midst, I would destroy you. And so God moves his place of dwelling from within Jerusalem, from within the tribes, in their midst, removes his presence from there and puts his presence in a tabernacle that is outside of the community. Let me read that to you. Exodus chapter 33 and verse 7. Now Moses used to take the tent and pitch it outside of the camp, far off from the camp. And he called it the tent of meeting. And everyone who sought the Lord would go out to the tent of meeting, which was outside of the camp. I see that as a type and a shadow, because God initially tells Israel, I want to dwell in your midst. But Israel has broken covenant with God. And because of that broken covenant, he says, I'm not going to dwell in your midst. I'm going to move outside of the camp. And if you're still interested in me, you can go outside of the camp to be where I am. I see that as a type and a shadow of Jesus being crucified outside of the city. And because Israel rejected their Messiah, once again they broke covenant with God. So God moved his presence outside of the gate and says, if you want communion with me, you'll forsake the altar that's there. And you'll go outside the camp to the altar that is Jesus' sacrifice. Powerful implications, isn't it? Such a weighted text. And I'm just amazed that thousands of years earlier, God was already pointing to the fact that things are not going to work out in Jerusalem with the Israelites. I'm going to have to push myself outside of that gate. And if you want to worship me, you're going to have to go outside of that gate and worship me outside of the camp. That's been the biblical thread all along. Something was going to happen in God's covenant relationship with mankind that would move it from Jerusalem to something that is outside of Jerusalem and outside of that temple where Jesus is. He says, because Christians are looking forward to a better city, a heavenly city not made with hands, a city that is still yet to come. I want to remind you that that's not a new concept. That's not a new concept. Because we see throughout the scriptures that that's the same thing the prophets were looking forward to. Not an earthly city, but a heavenly city not made with hands. Let me take you back through some texts. Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 13. Listen to this. Hebrews chapter 11 was the great faith chapter. All the people that should be commended for their great faith in biblical times. And he says, these all died in faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them and greeted them from afar, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. For people who speak thus make it clear that they are seeking a homeland. If they had been thinking of the land from which they had gone out, they would have had an opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country. That is a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, because He has prepared for them a city. Those that truly had a faith, allegiance-based covenant relationship with God knew that they were headed towards something transcendent, metaphysical, divine, not of this world. In our prophets class in Isaiah, we also see as far back as Isaiah this idea of a transcendent metaphysical city. Let me share it with you. This was called the Tale of Two Cities in our Isaiah class. But Isaiah 26 and verse 1, he says, in that day this song will be sung in the land of Judah. We have a strong city. He sets up salvation as walls and bulwarks. And He opens the gates so that the righteous nation that keeps faith, the nation that preserves that covenant relationship, the nation that exalts God in their life and preserves a fidelity, a solidarity, an allegiance and a faithfulness to the God of heaven, they will all be made into a nation. And they're the only ones that are going to be allowed to enter in through the gates. Now, if you look at that closely, if he would have been talking about an earthly city, he would have been talking about walls and bulwarks and protective devices. But when you look at the text, he says, no, we're not talking about walls made of stone. We're talking about walls. That is God's salvation. God's salvation is what protects you. Visions and elements of a transcendent heavenly reality, no longer brick and mortar places on the earth. In Revelation 21, again, we're shown a picture of this great city that we're waiting for. Revelation 21 and verse 1. And then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. And then I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. One day in the future, this new city, prepared especially for you, whose walls are God's salvation, and the only nation allowed in is composed of people that are faithful, allegiance, in covenant relationship with God. One day we're going to see that city descending for us, just as a bride being prepared for her husband. Therefore, we look forward to that city, and we have here no lasting city. This is a call for his readers to break ties, to shift your allegiance and your worldview and your yearning for that transcendent, divine, heavenly city. And for his readers in that first century, and you must break your allegiance, your infatuation with holy geographic places on earth. You're going to have to break your infatuation with that religious temple, that religious building. Break your infatuation with cities and states and geography and buildings and shift it to this heavenly reality, because he said, if you look to those things, you have no right to look up at those things. And if you are looking up at those things, then you better not turn around like Lot's wife and look back at those things. This message, even though this is a first century context, I want you to recognize that people have been deceived. Even though we've evolved away from geographic holy places and holy buildings, at some point, geographic holy places, geographic holy cities, geographically holy buildings have been resurrected out of the dust, and all kinds of people are being led astray and impassioned for those kinds of earthly places, which have taken their focus and their eyes off of the all-sufficiency of Christ. The all-sufficiency of Christ means we don't need to add anything to it, like a holy state or a holy building. And let me show you some of the ways in which this is being revived in our own culture. Rome and the Vatican. This is a lot of people's heart's desires have been swung in that direction, having been misled. States and buildings. Here's another one. The Kaaba in Mecca. A lot of people have been swooned, I don't know if that's the word, by this place. A physical location and a physical building. Here's another one. The temple in Salt Lake City. This one. Holy place, holy city, holy building. Is it really? I think the text that we've read today says, don't look back at any of these types of places. Just like the prophets of old, fix your eyes on the heavenly city, the eternal city, a city that has not been built with hands. All of those are just a corruption, a seduction, an enticement to worship the wrong thing. Why is this so important? Because that's the whole point that the author has been making in his argument. His final and most climactic argument about separating from the old is separate yourself from sacred geography and sacred buildings. Fix your mind on what's eternal and what is unsurpassed in glory. And he says, we have a different altar. Our altar is with Jesus Christ. And if Jesus Christ is found outside of the camp, then that's where we want to be. Outside of geographic holy places, outside of holy buildings. We want to be out there where the embarrassment and the shame of Christ is exactly what we embrace. Nothing added to it and nothing taken away from it.